Machine here, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel. 20-minute video for 2 minutes worth of content. Gold.
Fatality is the 5th person to join the ESL Hall of Fame, and so I thought it was only right that I give people kind of a primer as to who this guy is, because in the short video I was able to do to introduce him, I only had basically 30 seconds to a minute. So obviously, in terms of pure name value, Fatality is one of the most famous names in esports history. He is basically the first name to be heavily marketed outside of just the niche, hardcore competitive gaming scene into the wider gaming scene, slight penetration into the mainstream. Sure, you can make a case that a couple of years earlier, someone like Thresh kind of almost flirted with some of that, glimpsed a little bit of what was possible there, but he as a pro player did not continue on beyond Quake 2, and so when Quake 3 came along, Fatality became the #1 player, was able to very quickly parlay a lot of his initial success into this big marketing push, and so one of the things he was quite famous for, even years later after he was no longer an active player, was the marketing and merchandising success that he had with his brand, the Fatality brand, which went above and beyond anything else any individual pro player had accomplished at the time, and I don't know, perhaps even arguably has since, when you consider how most of them are still partnered with companies, not necessarily driving the product themselves. Funnily enough, this actually led to Fatality being criticised somewhat heavily and often quite unfairly from within gaming, which is why I made a video a few years back, which is about redeeming him by showing that he had all these incredible positives and had accomplished so much that I felt like people were being very petty in the way they criticised him. I also did a long-form reflections interview with him where he talks about his whole career, but let's initially address who he was as a player and the type of career he had, because he's someone who started out as a player in Quake. Now, notice I didn't say Quake World, because Quake World was actually mainly more of a European thing. It was NetQuake, which was just the original version of Quake that a lot of North American players were playing. People like Thresh, people like Fatality. Now, Fatality was not a famous player at the time. The scene was very small. He was also quite a young guy. He, funnily enough, did compete in Quake World years later, when in 2001, the CPL had a tournament called the 4-year anniversary, where a bunch of Quake World players or current Quake 3 players like CZM, who then switched back to Quake World for this one tournament, competed. Fatality finished 6th, respectable placing. Some of the players in that tournament were actual, like, full-time Quake World players, even though there wasn't really a top pro scene. It was just the top players at the time. Quake 3 Test came along, which was basically the beta before you got the full version of Quake 3 Arena. He competed at Frag 3 there, where famously he finished 3rd. At the time, he was a very reckless, very aggressive, very flashy player, which excited a lot of people, because at the time, the meta was a lot of slow-paced, playing Tony 2, sitting around corners, abusing teleporters, just trying to use amazing shaft, which is lightning gun aim, as opposed to being very flashy with a lot of movement, aggressive pushes. So it was a very stale meta, and he was really a breath of fresh air in that sense. Then we had the Excess Reality Invitational, which was a tournament where they brought people over to, I think it was Sweden. There was like 10 players, a bunch of ex-Quake 2 and Quake 3 players, and Quake World players rather, and Fatality was one of the few that wasn't coming from one of those big games. He won that with relative ease overall, undefeated. Then along came the first big tournament for Quake 3, which was the Razer CPL in, I think it was April of 2000. And this was the first big tournament, like a world championship level event that gathered together all the top players. He won this event. He won it in dominant fashion. And so as a result, that added to the Excess Invitational tournament, meant that he was the undisputed world #1. This is what really launched Fatality as a massive big name player. And already you started to see more of a professional approach to how to play the game itself. Less flashy, less risk taking, more about calculated risks, more about running the map, more about understanding what your opponent wants to do, how to stop him doing that, how to play your game to the max, and how to play a very consistent game, which not only keeps your performance level at a high level, but if you're #1, will hopefully keep you at #1 and winning championships. Now, quite quickly after this, actually, he did lose a tournament. He went to a CPL event called Atomic Asia, and at this tournament, which didn't have that many of the Westerners, he lost to the very talented player Blue, who was an amazing rail player, but at this particular tournament on DM13 had an interesting strategy that he was able to use to beat Fatality at this tournament. Fatality came back a few months later. Throughout the year, he'd been very good even in smaller lands. He was able to win the North American qualifier to go to the World Cyber Games Challenge. The reason I say challenge is because it wasn't the World Cyber Games that started the year after. This was the precursor event. He won the North American qualifier. He went there at the finals himself. He was able to win the tournament. He came first place ahead of Lakerman and 0-4 and a whole bunch of European players. A few months later, there was another CPL event outside of North America. This was in Europe. It was in Cologne, and he won this one. This is the one where he beat Fatality by, I think, a single frag on Tony 2 with an LG frag, where Fatality did an ill-advised jump up the jump pad. About a week later, we had, in fact, less than that in terms of when it began, we had the next big world championship in Quake, which was the Babbage's CPL in North America. This was the one that, again, was a very stacked tournament. It had a lot of upsets, and this is the one that's known for when kind of the passing of the torch happened between Fatality and 0-4, because 0-4 won this tournament. Remember, only a couple of months earlier, he'd lost out to Lakerman, had come third at the WCGC. Throughout that whole year, Fatality had beaten 0-4 a bunch of times, but this is when 0-4 made good. He won the big championship. From there on, he won enough big championships that in 2001, he was considered the best player for most of the time, and generally was considered to have taken the number one spot from Fatality, even though Fatality was a lot more active, thanks to the sponsorship and the fact he was a full-time pro gamer. So the next year, Fatality went to some more Quake tournaments. He went to a CPL event again in Asia. This was, I think it was in Australia or something. It was the Pacific event. He won this one. Not as many top players there. He went to CPL Holland, which was in May, and he finished third place here. He was finally beaten by Lakerman, who'd been unable to beat him for a long time, one of his rivals he'd kept down. And then he also lost to a player called Death, who ended up actually winning the tournament, this Russian player that shocked everyone. He went to QuakeCon later that year, even though he'd already begun to compete in other games. And at QuakeCon, he lost this time to 0-4. Twice, he lost on Pro 24. And then in the final, he lost a reasonably close game on ZTN. So 0-4 won that tournament as well and secured his spot as the number one player and maintained it. Fatality was considered to be not as good, even though he still finished second place at a massive North American Quake tournament. He also then later that year played another CPL tournament abroad, this time in Latin America, the Tilt Games tournament. And actually, he shockingly lost to a player called Reef there from Brazil and didn't win the tournament. Later, the next year, he would go to QuakeCon, and this is after he'd already been out of Quake for a while, but he attended this event again. He got revenge on 0-4, beat him. 0-4 went out way earlier than you'd imagine. And he ended up losing out to a player called Dela, who was quite unknown at the time, and finishing in third place. So we never got to see the final of him versus Lexa, which could have been one of the great games for the ages. Now, in 2002, he tried to go to the World Cyber Games, and he didn't qualify from that qualifier. In 2001, he'd been promised a qualifying spot. You can hear all this in my interview with him, but they ended up reneging on that shortly before. So he didn't want to go with only a week's practice. So he never went back to World Cyber Games again until like Quake 4, something like 6 years after his original performance. In Quake 3, his main rivals would be Machiavelli early on at the XSI and the Razor CPL, but he was beating him consistently. Lakerman, who he beat consistently right up until the end at CPL Holland, and even then Lakerman didn't win the title. Lakerman was a player who had one of those tragic careers of finishing second place a lot. And then 0-4. Now, here's the misconception. People think Fatality just lost to 0-4 all the time, and 0-4 was clearly the better player. That's actually an absolute nonsense in terms of their direct matchup. In 2000, 2001, Fatality was beating 0-4 pretty much every time he met him. At the end of 2000, 0-4 won the big tournament that Fatality was at, Babbage's, and then became the better player and definitely beat him in 2001. But you go to 2002, Fatality comes back, he gets his revenge on 0-4. It was a very interesting matchup. There were very different playing styles. Fatality played the map and had his consistent practice, where 0-4 played the man and was more positional. But actually a very interesting head-to-head matchup. Certainly a lot of respect between the two players. Obviously totally different approaches to interviews and marketing yourself, but don't take away from one champion because you want to big up another champion. Now, interestingly enough, other games drew Fatality away because in other games there weren't as many good players, and also if you won a big championship, that's money in your pocket. Quake after 2001 was falling away massively, and you were getting tournaments where first place, beating the best duelers in the world, only won you 5,000 euros. So Fatality was willing to try his hand at other games. So at the end of 2001, he played the Alien vs Predator 2 tournament at CPL Winter 2001. He won that tournament. That was the one where he won a motorbike that was worth something like $40,000, or was that one where he won a car? I think that was the one maybe he won a car and the bike was maybe an E3 tournament or something like that. I'm not entirely 100% sure. I think it was a car he won, like a Ford Focus or something. 2002, he competed at QuakeCon, but for the rest of the year, he was looking for other games. So, for example, he then switched up and played Unreal 2003, even though Unreal was a starkly different FPS game to Quake, and there was very little overlap in terms of players. Over he came to Unreal 2003. They had their first big tournament at CPL Winter 2002, ignore the naming, and as a result, he played against a bunch of top Unreal tournament players, and he beat them all, and he won the tournament. That was the one that was featured in the MTV True Life I'm a Gamer episode, the one that I was in for like 1 second interviewing him. The next year, he continued playing Unreal Tournament 2003. He went to ESWC, which is the big European championship, and he was able to finish third there, being shockingly upset by the Swede Zolg, who was an old school Unreal Tournament player, in the semi-finals. Otherwise, we could have had Gitz, the legendary Unreal Tournament 99 dueler of World Cyber Games fame, against Fatality. We never got that matchup, sadly. He tried to compete for the World Cyber Games in Unreal Tournament, but didn't qualify. He lost out to his rival Infinite, who's a guy he'd beaten at CPL Winter 2002, but had gotten the better of him here. After that, it basically just gradually fizzled out in terms of Unreal Tournament 2003. Briefly, he played Counter-Strike. In the latter part of 2003, he was playing with the Forsaken team, players like Warden, Storm, Faye, some Sunman, some very talented individuals, but he wasn't getting starting time and he didn't get to start at the CPL that year. At the CXG, he played with his own team late that year, a team called iFate that he created, which was like Destruct, Unreal Tournament player, but also Counter-Strike player, and then a few players who were known players at the time but won't be as famous names now from the North American CS scene. Briefly, like kind of flirted with moving to CS properly, but then in 2004, we got Painkiller come along. And initially, he was one of the people who competed in Painkiller before we knew it would be the World Tour game. He competed at ESWC, finished fourth. He competed at CPL Summer, he finished second, losing to VeXii there. He competed at CPL Winter and finished third. 2005, we find out that Painkiller is the main game of the CPL World Tour, which is going to have 10 stops in total and $1 million total prize money across the 10 stops. Obviously more put aside for the 10th stop, which was the big World Tour finals in New York. Fatality's already playing Painkiller, so he goes all in on that. But the learning curve's steep. First event was CPL Turkey. He only finished fourth. Next event was CPL Spain. These were month after month. He only finished sixth. After that, he started to get a hang of the learning curve. He switched up some details, like he started to play without mouse accel and found out that Painkiller was a much faster game, so it was more about movement than it was about raw precision in aiming. Then CPL Brazil comes along. He gets second place. He loses to VeXii in the final. Then along comes CPL Sweden. He gets second place, loses to VeXii in the final. VeXii was easily the best player, never failed to finish top 3, I think, at every single slot. Then, though, comes the interesting one, because at CPL Summer, which was held in Dallas, at the traditional CPL spot, he beats VeXii and he wins the tournament. Then at CPL UK, VeXii strikes back, Fatality finishes second. CPL Singapore, Fatality wins, he beats VeXii again. CPL Italy, VeXii wins, Fatality second place. CPL Chile, neither of them win, it was the weird one with Strider and Gelisak in the final, so Fatality was 5th place. Then at the World Tour Finals, where the big prize money was, first place 150k, even though he lost to VeXii in the upper bracket, he beat VeXii twice coming from the lower bracket to win the tournament with the most high pressure moment, with a massive clutch win in the final, to overall win the tour in terms of prize money, even though the MVP, the most tour spots, were won by VeXii, who was considered the best player overall. Now, Fatality always said this stat, which is entirely true, which is, since there was 10 slots overall, if you go to the median one, which is the middle one, the fifth one would be Summer. Well, from Summer onwards, so that just over the second half of the tour, Fatality actually won more spots than VeXii did, because he won Summer, Singapore, and the World Tour Finals. VeXii won the UK, Italy, and then that was it. Came second place at a bunch of them. So you could still say VeXii was the better player, but Fatality owned the key moments of the latter part of that rivalry, even though this was a very closely contested rivalry, and VeXii early on was beaten in big time. So an interesting one there, because we had Fatality come into another game that's very different from his game, start practicing, play the best players from that game, and just as in the other one, he was able to win the Unreal Tournament CPL, this time he was even able to win the main tournament ever held in Painkiller. So it showed again his ability to change games, practice, adapt himself to a new game, learn how to play specific opponents and find victory, which would be a hallmark of his entire career. He wasn't just a Quake player or just a gamer in general. Then obviously before then and in amongst that, back in 2004, when he'd been playing in Painkiller before the World Tour, there was also a Quake Con tournament held in Doom 3, I think it was at the time, which at the time as a game, I think hadn't come out. And he won that. He beat out Dela and he beat out Gopher, which is Toxic's brother. And he won that big championship for some good money. Obviously, it wasn't a massively developed game and it was a brand new game, but he still showed his ability to swap between different FPS games. Then, after the World Tour, Fatality had briefly stepped aside while Quake 4 got going with the CPLs and the DreamHacks and the WVSG. tour going on. And CPL, I remember, had started with Quake 4 at the end of 2005. At CPL Winter 2005, they'd had the big final where Cooler had actually beaten Toxic. They'd gone on to be two of the big players. Fox was playing in the early days. Fatality didn't get involved until basically, like, I think it was like halfway into 2006. So he gave other people quite a head start on himself. But then he started to go heavily at Quake 4 because he wanted to compete. So he went to WSVG ISC and actually managed a decent placing, 4th place. Pretty good considering how many other players had played all year. In South Africa, he went to a tournament called the Rage Expo. This is a little bit more underwhelming. He finished 2nd place there, losing to Lost Cause, who had, yes, been a good player over the summer, but ultimately wouldn't prove to be one of the elite players by the end of the tour. The Digital Life GGL tournament, he finished 3rd at back in New York. He didn't place highly at the World Cyber Games. And then he went to the WSVG finals. And amazingly, he almost replicated what he did in Painkiller, but in an even shorter time span. Because despite the fact he hadn't won any tournaments in Quake 4, and the dominant player in Quake 4 was Toxic, the incredible Swedish player who'd won almost every tournament he played at. And if he didn't win, he'd often come 2nd or 3rd. He was unbelievably dominant. Well, Fatality got to the final and even beat Toxic initially to win a series against him, and then Toxic picked it up. Toxic played amazingly and Toxic won the finals. So Fatality again scored a big victory over the dominant player, went head to head with him, was able to get his game up to speed much quicker than most other people and catch up for lost time in a game that wasn't necessarily his forte compared to some of the other established players. Now Fatality, the reason he was able to do a lot of these amazing things in terms of like accomplishments and daring and being brave, it's funny, a lot of the Quake players tried to make it sound like he'd been scared out of Quake 3 because 0-4 was better now and he was scared to go head to head with him and lose. No, he went elsewhere and won other championships, and in some of these games had to play in much bigger profile games with more prize money, more people trying to compete, and some of the best players already in that game ready to welcome him in, like, come on in, I want to get a scalper Fatality and beat these guys or get to their level or compete against them. So the reason he was able to do these, what I consider amazing accomplishments compared to almost anyone else in esports history, no one's got a track record like this of ability to switch games and be successful, it's because Fatality was way ahead of the industry in terms of like true sporting professionalism. This is a guy who had preparation and understanding of preparation that nobody else had. He was already practicing and practicing with purpose and the number of hours a day you need to practice as a sportsman way before everyone else. When everyone else was just dicking around, just playing some games to get into form or saying, I'm pretty good right now, I don't need to play much, or just playing and trying to just win the scrim, not trying to actually practice a specific thing or test things or work on your timing. They were just playing to win and see if I'm better than him, I must be good when I go to the tournament. He also was practicing in terms of specific opponents and styles of play and getting practice partners who he regularly worked with where he knew they wouldn't leak information, and he could test things out against those guys, and as a result he could stylistically match up with people who might be better or worse than him but might be dangerous or less dangerous. He also had one of the best understandings ever of how to peak at the right time in a tournament. Not to be at your best 2 months before the World Tour finals happened, like you could argue someone like Vu did. Or not to be in a position where you're potentially going to chalk away the first game of a final like Toxic did against him at WSVG. No, Fatality was always at his best in the big tournament. He was always getting into his best form for the big tournament. And he always was able to play, if not his best, then among his best, and play with poise in the big game, the big high pressure match, where other people, some of them more talented, might actually flounder and not be able to bring out their A game, but Fatality could play well enough that he could either win or test them to the absolute limit. He also was somebody who worked on diet and exercise. He's a guy who tried to stay fit, trying to keep things in his life that weren't about just playing the game, even though he played the game more than anyone else. He's also someone who had an interesting approach in terms of diet, because he says in his interview I did with him, he used to just eat a huge breakfast and not eat all day long. He wanted to be on a stable baseline, didn't want to have like sugar crashes or be drinking an energy drink. So he's a guy who was thinking about the game, even if he didn't always apply with the most optimal strategy, thinking about it more than other people. It's like that great saying, like, if I have 6 hours to chop a tree, then I spend the first hours sharpening the axe. Like, he wants it to be super efficient when he does something. So you can downplay Fatality's career all you want, you can big it up all you want. I mean, he certainly, in terms of marketing, bigged it up too much. He like claimed that every championship he'd won was a world championship. No, there was about 3 or 4 world championships in there, which is amazing, and across multiple games, by the way. But certainly, like, CPL World Tour Stops weren't world championships. But he understands that aspect. That's just part of the marketing game, I'm afraid. So while some aspects were overblown and some people wanted to, believe it or not, make fun of him in the early days because he tried to be a pro, tried to practice all the time and was too much of a tryhard, he ended up as a result having a much more legendary career than any of his peers. He accomplished feats and feats of difficulty that go beyond anyone else and was truly one of the special esports competitors that we had in history. This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, Tobias Bernasconi, OllieJ, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, James Harding, VeXii, Robert Baxter, Lucas Kerza Szczesny, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to feature in my upcoming content? Perhaps you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Do you want teasers from my upcoming content? See who the next guests are going to be. Perhaps you'd like to take part in a discussion about esports with me. Well, any and all of the above exclusives are available for my patrons, so put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.